Right now, Dr. Wang is working as a local language instructor in Ithaca, teaching ESL at TST BOCES and Mandarin at Raft Education. We are delighted to hear more from her about her research on chunking in second language education. Please help me welcome Dr. Wang.
Thanks, Angelica, for this lovely introduction. And hi, everyone. Uh, my name is Serene, and today I will be talking about chunking in the second language, or L2 for short. Um, Before I get into chunking, I'd like to start with a little anecdote. For those of you who don't know me, I grew up in a small city in China, where English as a second language was formally introduced to school curriculum when I was in the third grade. Fast forward 6 years later, I visited the United States for the very first time. However, despite having aced all of the English exams in school, I had a very hard time understanding what people were saying to me, nor could I talk back to them using fluent speech. And I was not alone in this situation. Many L2 learners often have difficulties navigating the target language environment despite years of learning. Why is this the case? Why can't the L2 learners communicate in the target language environment so easily? To answer this question, we need to take a closer look at how L1 and L2 are typically learned. When infants and children are learning their first language or first languages, their caregivers typically spend hours talking to them every single day using complete sentences. For example, my mom may say to me, 看，这儿有个大苹果. Okay, I know those of you who don't know Mandarin probably had no idea what I just said, and you didn't even know where the word started and ended. But don't worry, because I didn't know either when she said that to me back then. Moreover, if I presented the English translation of the sentence I just said, you would have understood it. Look, there is a big apple. You know what to do when people tell you to look. You know there is means something exists. You know how a big apple differs from a small apple. But what did I know? I didn't even know what an apple was. So when I heard those sentences, I had to rely on the co-occurrence of sounds to figure out where words might start and end, to pay attention to my surroundings, and what's in front of me to figure out what the sound sequence might mean. So I was learning the language while simultaneously learning about the world. By the time I was in the third grade, or about 9 or 10 years old, not only was I perfectly fluent in my first language, but I have also established a decent system of conceptual knowledge in my first language. So, did I still need to listen to complete sentences where I had no idea where the word boundaries were while trying to figure out how things work in the world? Of course not. That's too taxing. And I already have a whole lot of knowledge that can provide me with a shortcut to learn my second language more efficiently. So, how did I learn this new language this time? Word lists. By this approach, if I studied hard, I can totally memorize 500 words every day. And that can add up to 3,000 words within a week. And I can even take the Sunday off. How cool is that? But of course, my English teacher's kind of aware that we need to put words into complete sentences in order to express more complex meaning. How did we approach that? I know there are a lot of Chinese characters on this slide, but I can explain. Um, Here is a summary of grammatical rules with regard to verb tenses. As an example, when you see uh, these words like every, often, always, on this day, or in this month, you're supposed to change the verb um, according to this column by adding an S or ES or changing the Y to IES, or refer to this column for exceptions. And the promise is once I memorize these rules, I can plug in any nouns and verbs I memorized from the vocab lists, and I should be good. And for more practice, I was assigned a lot of the fill in the blanks questions, like 30 or 40 every day for 6 years before I got here. So as you can see, I learned my fair share of vocabulary and grammar. So in theory, I should be okay when I move to the States, right? But why did I feel like I didn't understand a word of English when I actually got here? Here, I want to make an important distinction between online and offline language processing. Online means in real time, moment by moment, while the stimulus is still there. Offline means either a static system of knowledge stored in the long term memory, or after the stimulus is gone, after online processing had already taken place. So the words and grammatical rules I memorized were sufficient for me to ace all the offline tasks on the English exams, like reading and filling the blanks. But the problem is, they didn't really help all that much with online L2 processing. Why is that the case? Before I answer this question, I have a little challenge for you. I'm going to play an audio clip containing some words, and I would like you to remember as many words as you can in the correct order. Ready? Okay.
Go ahead when you're ready.
Familiar, the, to, fun, have, no, edge, not, don't, some, me, really.
Anyone? You're so fun. Is that the correct order? So yeah, as you can see, this task is quite difficult. You do have enough vocabulary knowledge to recognize each word, but there were just too many of them going too fast, and you can't keep up with them very effectively. Where's my mouse? Okay. And that, a lot of times, is very similar to how L2 learners feel when they communicate in their second language. Language is fleeting. At a normal speech rate, an average native English speaker can produce about 150 words per minute, and that breaks down to about 5 to 6 syllables or 10 to 15 phonemes per second. But the human auditory resolution is 10 sounds per second, meaning any non speech sounds faster than that would be recognized as a continuous buzz rather than a series of discrete auditory events. On top of that, the working memory is also very limited, as it can hold and process a small amount of information at any given moment, ranging from 3 to 5 or 5 to 9 units at a time. And after each sound is made, the physical trace of the information is gone and is overwritten by the next sounds you hear. Therefore, real-time language processing could have been an impossible task for anyone due to this now or never bottleneck. But how do L1 speakers manage this? How can they understand language at all? Before diving more deeply into this question, I would like to give you a second chance at the memory task. So similar to last time, I will be playing an audio clip, and I would like you to remember as many words as possible in the correct order. Ready?
To, the, edge, have, some, fun, don't, know, me, not really familiar.
So yeah, we're doing better this time, right? Instead of working with 12 random words, this time we remembered this list as 4 chunks. To the edge, have some fun, don't know me, not really familiar. And this is the key to real-time language comprehension. We engage in a process called chunk and pass processing. Chunking here means grouping different elements together into fewer, larger, and coherent units. So as the fast and continuous speech input comes in, we rapidly chunk the inputs into larger and more meaningful units, from phonemes to syllables to words and to phrases and beyond. And we do this in real time as the speech input comes in, so we can understand it before it's gone forever. And this is exactly what infants and children are trained to do when they're learning their first language. Without any linguistic, metalinguistic, or conceptual knowledge, they have to work with the rapidly fleeting, continuous streams of sounds, trying to extract patterns and regularities in the input and using them to form chunks of varying sizes to represent and convey meaning. The linguistic labels they learn thus include both single words and larger chunks, such as phrases, collocations, and idioms. And indeed, chunks are both recognized faster and remembered better compared to single words or length-controlled, non-chunkable items. Now let's take a closer look at how chunking arises in L1 versus L2 chunking or learning. When infants are learning their first language or first languages, they learn the verbal labels together with the concepts. Therefore, they build a direct L1 conceptual link that's solid and strong. And the linguistic labels they learn include both single words and multi-word chunks. Because humans use co-occurring sequences of sounds rather than discrete single words as building blocks for language, there are a lot of chunks in language produced by native speakers. According to several corpus analyses, prefabricated multi-word chunks are as common as single words, making up to 50% of language production. And they are even more prevalent in spoken language than in writing because the former involves more real-time processing that requires chunking to alleviate the cognitive loads. But when it comes to the second language, because the learners have already established a functional system of conceptual knowledge stored in the first language, they don't feel the need to go through this process of speech segmentation and conceptual learning again. And they are well aware of the existence of discrete words and their role as the building block for language. So they could simply associate the L2 labels with the L1 labels and then retrieve meaning through the strong L1 conceptual links. And the L2 labels they learn are mostly discrete words. By now, I'm sure you can see how this approach is not conducive to real-time processing because it works against chunking. In addition, because the learners form L2, L1 lexical links rather than direct L2 conceptual links, the association between the L2 labels and the concepts are weaker and harder to access. It would have been okay if the task is offline, but when the task is online, where speech input comes in fast and continuous, it is nearly impossible to keep it all up if we have to go back to L1 translation for each single word to retrieve meaning. And this is true for the words plug into rules approach as well. it would have been okay if the task is offline, and that's why we can pass standardized proficiency tests, but it doesn't mean that we can handle the communicative demands of conversations. And moreover, because L2 learners are already slowed down by lexical access during online processing, they're less likely to learn from statistical regularities in the input. When they can only process so much information at any given moment, they kind of have to grab onto those individual words that make sense to them. And because all the cognitive resources are directed to the meaning of each word, they are less likely to pay attention to how these words are combined or whether some words appear together as clusters across situations. And on top of that, they also tend to pay selective attention to prioritize certain words over others. For example, we know that content words or words that carry meaning, like nouns and verbs, are typically what's important in a sentence because they carry a lot of meaning. And so L2 learners tend to attend to these words rather than the function words, which carry a lot less meaning. And so they would neglect how words are combined in context, resulting in repeated errors even after extensive exposure. In sum, the second language is usually learned and processed as individual words, over-segmented and under-chunked. And that's why that's what's largely holding the learners back from achieving native-like proficiency during online comprehension and production. And as a result, L2 learners tend to struggle with the use of chunks. They have limited knowledge of multi-word units compared to both L1 speakers and their own L2 vocabulary. They often treat chunks as separate words and recognize chunks much slower compared to L1 speakers. They also use less chunks in language production and produce broken chunks where component words get replaced or jumbled. And they make repeated errors with articles, grammatical genders, preposition phrases, and so on and so forth. And when we put these two together, we can see that there is a clear mismatch between the prevalence of chunks in natural language and L2 learners' tendency to underuse those chunks to facilitate real-time language comprehension and production. Therefore, many researchers have concluded that chunking is one of the most telling differences between L1 and L2 speakers. So, what are the complications or implications of this? Is chunking equally important for real-time processing of both L1 and L2? During my time at Cornell, I conducted 3 empirical studies to answer this question. I won't bore you with all the technical details of experimental designs and statistical models, but I do want to share some of the main findings with you. In the first project, we looked at the relationship between chunking and the speed of online L2 processing, and we found that the ability to recall more auditorily presented L2 chunks was associated with faster L2 processing. Importantly, to facilitate faster sentence processing, chunks must be treated as coherent units rather than discrete words. The ability to recall L1 chunks, on the other hand, is not related to L2 processing, suggesting that the relationship between chunking and real-time processing is language-specific. Namely, to reach faster processing speed in the second language, we need to focus on improving L2 chunking skills rather than relying on chunking skills in the first language. And in the second project, we tested the utility of an utterance recall task. and assessing real-time second language proficiency. The task is fairly simple. The learner hears a sentence and then they'll be asked to repeat it back as exact as possible. And the rationale behind this task is that when the stimulus sentence exceeds the working memory capacity, rote memorization is disabled. And so recall must rely on real-time comprehension and subsequent reconstruction of meaning by retrieving previously learned linguistic constructions from long-term L2 knowledge. We also developed an automatic scoring scheme where each item can be scored objectively, meaning there's no human bias, and precisely, meaning rather than a simple right or wrong, like for a multiple choice question, each item can be scored precisely with a percentage score. And the results showed that this task can capture chunking and real-time processing and measure comprehension production simultaneously, while also tapping into long-term L2 knowledge in an objective and precise manner. It was the single best predictor of real-time proficiency, and it outperformed traditional measures such as multiple choice questions and self-reports. In Project 3, we moved beyond the domain of language processing per se and tested these psycholinguistic constructs in content knowledge learning. We measured chunking sensitivity, which is the ability to group linguistic units into larger chunks while controlling for individual word access. And we measured real-time proficiency using the utterance recall task we just mentioned. We found that higher chunking sensitivity and better real-time language processing skills are independently associated with better learning and memory outcomes for content knowledge. Namely, the knowledge that we learn in content courses, such as biology and animal behavior. And this is true for both domestic students using their primary language and international students learning the same materials using their second language. Here's a recap taken together. These findings suggest that L1 speakers and L2 learners are faced with the same cognitive demands in real-time language processing. Chunking is a key cognitive mechanism to overcome the now or never bottleneck in both L1 and L2. And it has important implications for online sentence processing, language proficiency, and memory outcomes for content knowledge learned in the target language. So what differentiates L1 and L2 speakers is not how language needs to be processed in real time, but the degree of tuning to the language-specific statistical regularities that enables chunking, which in turn affects real-time language processing. So, implications for language education. Language learning should address the cognitive demands of real-time processing, overcoming the now or never bottleneck so that we can understand, be understood, exchange ideas, and connect with other people using that the target language. And to facilitate that, we can incorporate a chunk and processing-based language pedagogy, where we expose our students to vast, authentic inputs containing rich statistical regularities in the target language. Teach them how to pay attention to these patterns, such as how words are combined and what sequences of words co-occur across situations. And teach chunks as coherent units, not just the well-known ones like idioms and collocations, but also intransitive verbs, noun preposition clusters, article noun pairings, signaling grammatical gender, and so on and so forth. Teach them as coherent single units rather than flexible combinations of words presented in the fill in the blanks questions that visually and cognitively oversegment the chunks. If you think, well, that was abstract, don't worry, I have some concrete tips as well. First, create a language environment so that students can learn the target language like babies learning their first language, namely through real-time processing in communication and social interactions. I think nowadays language education is doing a much better job in this regard using a communication-based approach, unlike when I had to learn English in China. And I actually learned this during my teacher training courses here at Cornell. So shout out to our wonderful language teachers and programs. So yeah, keep up with the good work. Start with listen to me and repeat after me. Talk to your students, set up contexts, and let them speak. And besides engaging in conversations, watching TV shows, movies without subtitles can also be a good way to learn and to be immersed in rich cultural contexts. So encourage your students to watch shows in their target language outside the classroom, again, without subtitles. Tell your students that it is okay to not be able to understand everything right away. Repeated exposure by itself, even without full comprehension, is learning. And this listening modality can really help with chunking because the linguistic input is presented as continuous streams of sounds rather than discrete words written with white spaces, separating them into individual lexical items. As for fill in the blank questions and multiple choice questions, well, ditch those completely. I do not think they are effective for language learning at all because doing these offline tasks is not what language is. The most effective way of learning anything is to target the skills directly involved in the subject matter. So, in the case of language, it is processing fleeting linguistic input and generating speech output in real time. But of course, reading is also an important part of language learning. So when you do present language visually, ask your students to highlight linguistic chunks so that they can notice how prevalent prefabricated multi-word units are, and be aware of which words might go together as coherent chunks across situations. It is also important to note that simply highlighting isn't enough to have students commit these chunks into their language repertoire because they're only seeing each chunk a few times across large amounts of texts. So to help with that, we can intentionally increase exposure to and repetitions of subsets of chunks. For example, we can present a list of useful chunks as opposed to vocabulary lists. I should also note that we need to repeat these target chunks many, many, many times across many different sentence contexts so that the students can really group these words into single coherent units in their minds. And it is always good to start with larger units rather than smaller ones. I know in some classrooms, the teachers like to introduce vocabulary words before showing full context, such as in a scenario or a video. They would argue this way the students can recognize these words and see how they function in a sentence. However, multiple studies have shown that presenting full sentences prior to showing isolated single words yields better learning outcomes. Those who heard full sentences first, where they had no idea what anything meant or where words started and ended, performed much better later on in using the correct grammatical genders than those who heard each word as single vocabulary items first, despite the amount and quality of exposure being held consistent between groups. And many of us as language teachers might have noticed a discrepancy between comprehension and production skills among quite a few students. Well, the good news is research has shown that enhancing chunking skills in the target language can help improve both comprehension and production proficiency at the same time. And finally, if you recall the utterance recall task, it covers basically all the cognitive mechanisms we need for real-time language processing. So use this task as a training tool can really help students directly practice these skills as needed for enabling conversations in the target language. All right, thank you very much. Any questions?
I had an impression that your chunks are always continuous. Are chunks sometimes broken up and perhaps other chunks are inserted between the beginning of a chunk and the ending of the chunk?
That is a good question. So, a sentence can be segmented in many different ways. And there are, bigrams, meaning two-word chunks, or trigram, three-word chunks. And usually, like the shorter a chunk is, the more frequent the chunk appears across different situations. So, it is not set. Like the chunks are not set, but it would vary in frequencies when the lengths vary. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I should have explained the reason, perhaps, for my question. Presenting phrases from Go, from get ready and go is wonderful, and everybody practices it. Presenting short clauses works the same way. Fine, the whole chunk is one clause, and we can do that in the target language. We don't have to explain this in English, breaking up the connections that you very nicely illustrated. But then students start running into a complicated syntactic constructions, and that whole approach breaks down. You have to start explaining how sentences are structured, how the verb can be at the end, and the grammatical subject can be at the beginning, in the middle, or at the end. And in fact, a verb can be separated from its habitual object by a whole bunch of additional information. That's where students stop learning unless you explain in their own first language.
Okay, I see your points, but I don't really agree that they stop learning. So, when infants and children, they're learning their first languages, they don't understand why certain things go with certain other things. And they just try to figure it out. Like they listen actively, they try to work with what is presented to them. And they spend years making mistakes along the way. So for L2 learners, maybe like immediately within the language classroom, if you do not explain, they're like making all sorts of mistakes. They do not learn the target thing that you are trying to teach, but it doesn't mean that they are not learning. With more exposures, with more repetitions, with more examples along the way, maybe sometime later they start to make sense of how words are combined. And my advisor used to say, you don't need to know the laws of physics to be able to play tennis. Language is like that. Like for the adults, like we want to be able to make sense of things, to understand things immediately. And if we don't, we feel like we're not learning. But it's okay. Language is largely an implicit process. So yeah, even if they don't make sense of it immediately, with more exposure, with more repetitions, with more years of learning, they will eventually get there. And babies too, they spend many, many years, 10 years or so, making mistakes.
When I also think the assumption is not that we're only using chunking, right, as a mechanism to teach language. It's just like one optional way to verify our teaching. We're not only, oh, no, 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 that's not the implication here, that we're, you mischunked me.
Yes, it struck me there in looking at your talk before I came, there's a bit of an analogy between the artificial intelligence field and the language, because the original model for AI in the 70s was supposed to be, it was going to be all this rules-based, like your elaborate grammar that you had to be subjected to in China, whereas the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2024 to Geoffrey Hinton was about these large language models, which he uses the analogy to a baby kind of experiencing the world. And he has his own disagreements with Chomsky. But the chunking seems to have an analogy between the way we learn the language, and the people would think that the naive learning model of the neural nets that was dismissed in the 70s and 80s, but then we've seen how it's leaped forward with AlphaGo and now being applied to winning math Olympiads and writing and so forth. And so anyway, I'd just be interested in any comments you have on the artificial intelligence analog.
Yeah, I totally agree with what you just said, because in the 1960s there was the cognitive revolution started by Chomsky, and he, without doing any empirical experiments, just sat at his desk and started writing. And he thought that humans have universal grammar encoded in the genes, and language is not learned but acquired, meaning that as you develop you hear words, and then the words are just automatically mapped onto the innate rules that you already have. And that's why, like, in the 70s and 80s, people did not believe that computers can learn human language, or use language the same way the humans do, because computers don't have genes carry language. But later on, now, like, large language models, they work by predicting the next word in the sentence. So they are predicting based on statistical regularities in the inputs that they got from humans. And then they use frequency and co-occurrence information to write the sentences. And then now they're doing a much better job at using human language. And that is actually providing more evidence that humans do not have, or humans do not need to have language rules encoded in the genes to be able to use language later on. And we can simply learn language through exposure and through statistical learning.
Thank you very much for inspiring talk. I was really resonated my experience when I first came to America. Even if I knew English, I had a very hard time to understand what people are saying, because it's even I asked them to, can you spell that out for me? Then I knew that word, but why I didn't understand what they're talking instantly at that time. But as time goes by, then I'm used to their phrasing, and also the rhythm of their talking. So I'm getting used to that. So it was really very impressive. I'd like to know, what do you think about like a communicative approach? Communicative approach appears, and then we kind of get rid of repetition, like a drill exercises. But chunking sounds like you recommend it as implication for the language education that we can repeat and like make students to be exposed to this kind of thing and repetition kind of thing. But the drill exercise is kind of like I don't know, it is banned like when once the like a communicative language approaches, because language is like a creation with language is not a repetition. So that's why that, we get rid of like memorizing sentences or dialogues from the sentences. But, this is very interesting because it sounds very effective, when students are exposed to this chunking. And also I'd like to know how this chunking is different from phrasing. So, could you explain that for me? Thank you.
Okay, so I would like to say that chunking is not the complete picture of real-time processing. To master real-time processing, you need at least two components, which is repeated exposure, as you said, like repetitions and drills, and the other is improvisation. So like use language generatively, like creatively, like use what you already know, like the knowledge that you have stored from drilling to create new sentences in new contexts. So like you need both to be able to communicate effectively. Um, as to phrase, I'm not sure what you mean by phrasing. Can you explain?
I don't know. So it's like in one long sentence, and like for example, like in Korean, there is a way to make a pause kind of thing. So, so when I just hear what students are reading Korean sentences, I can clearly say that if the students can understand the content or not by phrasing. So they should like make a pause at a right, like a normal, like a native Korean people speaker will say. Do you know what I mean?
Okay, so it's like sentence segmentation, right? Like segmenting a sentence into smaller units, sort of that. Yeah, I think sentence segmentation and chunking, they work hand in hand in real-time language processing, right? Like when you hear full sentences, you need to be able to segment the full sentence into workable linguistic units, but at the same time, you're also working like from smaller units into larger units, for like so from phonemes to syllables to words and to phrases and sentences. Did you have a question?
Thank you very much for your presentation. I think there are lots of things on the chunk-based language pedagogy that you approached. I was wondering about the challenges in this approach, and I was thinking about myself also as a learner of English. Just to give an example, I first learned cup of wine, bottle of wine, and for me to say bottle of water was very difficult because I had bottle of wine in my head. I also remember a friend that she learned city of New York, so she could say city, put an instead of say city, for example. So she knew how to pronounce T in that chunk, but she could not transfer that knowledge to other words like bottle, for example, or I don't know, butter. So I was wondering what would be the challenge to learn chunks, and maybe if the difficulty to transfer other outside that chunk that you learn. Thank you.
That is a very interesting question. Yeah, sometimes like when you learn chunks as a coherent unit, you're like, I mastered this chunk. But then when some other chunks like feature similar components, all of a sudden like it's new, right? I think this question can maybe better answered by Jules, who is like learning about statistical learning and generalization. So like you need to basically learn enough, like see enough of regularities to be able to eventually generalize. Do you want to add a comment?
No. So I actually had two questions. Thank you so much for giving this presentation and for opening it to the public. I teach Spanish at the high school, and so I'm here to ask some questions about that. The first thing I wanted to say is that chunking makes sense to me, especially with regard to prepositions. As a learner of German, I think that is with conjugation of verb and how that is affected by which preposition. I think that chunking makes a lot of sense with teaching this in particular. And then I was wondering, we've read a lot and we've heard a lot about the language, the whole language approach and communicative approach as well. But I wonder how, if you're introducing chunking, at what point do you make it explicit to your students that it's this is the grammatical term, rather than just saying I'm exposing you to this over and over and over again? At what point do you then switch and kind of give that metacognitive moment to them to say this is why this works, right? So how do you resolve that tension?
Oh, that is such a good question. It is something I'm thinking about, because right now I'm also a language teacher, and I'm like trying to develop this, chunk and processing based approach, and I would like to, I don't know, make it more accessible to others and like, so that other teachers can also like think about this and like contribute to this and maybe use this in their classrooms. And so I don't yet have all the answers. I do not know like when to tell your students that, this is the approach that we're using because, right? Yeah, it is difficult to introduce this early on because right, it is hard to communicate with them without having enough knowledge yet. But then like later, right, like there's like no point in time that we think of it, right? So I don't know yet. Hopefully all of you can give me an idea.
I have another. Okay, this is a comment. You suggested to watch the dramas without subtitles, but when I first started learning Japanese, I really enjoyed watching Japanese dramas. And first, without subtitles, I really didn't understand at all. But when I used the subtitles and I could see those phrases that I learned from class, then it appeared. And but first, I didn't understand. But with that, constantly, I can compare speaking and then reading together. Then I could grasp, the sense. So I thought that, with the subtitle, also very effective when you're learning. And I use the subtitle. Maybe I can rely more on the subtitles, but when I'm used to more, my Japanese skills are improved a little bit, little by little, and then I could just ignore the subtitles sometimes and I could get it, at once kind of thing. So, I don't want to ask my students to just ask them to not to use subtitles at all. That is very discouraging because, they may have, grasp some like a phrases or, the words or sentences that they already learned and they should have known. But, without them, they will just fly away, right? So they can grab. So I think that it is okay to start with subtitles. Then later on, then they can just get rid of subtitles.
I see. Yeah. By subtitles, I actually like meant translations using the base language. Like I do not encourage watching subtitles in the base language. Like in the target language, maybe, right? It may be able to help them like understand in the moment, but without subtitles, they're still learning, especially if you ask them to watch the same episodes over and over. And like when watching it for the first time, like, what is this? Second time, huh? And then after like a few times, they're like, wait, I recognize this. And and
But using that subtitle really helped me and give me confidence, more confidence as well.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, like as adults, we don't allow ourselves to be confused. We want to be we want to understand, and we feel like only when we understand we're learning. But that's the case. It's okay. Like children, like when babies are learning their first languages, they don't know anything. They like there's right like there's no knowledge at all built in the brain, so like they don't understand language. You're talking very fast, you're kind of singing, and they don't know what things are, right? Like they don't know this everything like in front of them. They're like trying to figure out and I guess for babies, that's their whole job, right? Like they are just trying to develop to learn how to be humans. But for us, for adults, we're like, we need to be able to know this. Like, right? We're busy. We have a life. We need to know this, but it's okay. Yeah. So if you want to, um, encourage your students to use subtitles, use the target language, not the base language.
So there actually is a whole body of research on subtitling, and I think it depends on what the goal is for you or for your students. It can be helpful to have both at the same time, English and the target language, but it depends on the level of the learner, depends on exactly what are you trying to have your students do. Is it about just listening comprehension or is it about something else? So there is a whole field out there that investigates this.
So, would you describe, I'm just trying to make sure I'm getting correctly what you're saying. Would you describe your chunking approach to teaching language as more of like a delayed gratification, like you won't see results immediately, but down the line you'll understand better? Like, is this more in a long-term complete fluency approach, or are you seeing people immediately picking things up quicker? Like, is it just oh, eventually you will learn this, or is this like more effective in the short term as well?
That is a good question. I personally do not do artificial language learning studies, so I don't know. Um, so I don't know whether they like learn stuff immediately in the short term, but I think most certainly that it works in the long term. So like right now, like based on the words plug into rules approach, L2 learners almost never reach native like fluency. If like they start learning the second language after already having, the first language in place. Um, so I think this chunking approach definitely helps in the long run, but in the short term, I am not sure. I am seeing some uh, artificial language learning studies, such as these two. So like within um, some, experimental sessions, these individuals who saw the full sentences first still got the grammatical gender pairings correctly, more so than the people who saw individual words first.
Wonderful. I want to be mindful of time. Is there one more question, maybe? Oh, yep. Okay.
I'll just offer one brief anecdote that I got from a friend recently. He was a translator over the years with the Soviets and the Russians, and he went to Harvard in Soviet studies in the 70s, and he realized after 4 years he really couldn't communicate in Russian with someone from the UN or something like that in Russian. So he went off to a language institute in Vermont, and it happened to be that Solzhenitsyn had just arrived at that same institute, and other colleagues of his that had been in the gulags taught there as well. And he experienced in sort of real time emotion and the discussions across the table there. And he became an excellent translator, able to convey that emotion with the Russians. And he didn't understand a lot at first when Solzhenitsyn was saying to his colleagues, but somehow, anyway, just the role of emotion maybe being kind of part of his chunking and exposure to the culture was one aspect of kind of early chunking.
Yes, what you mentioned is probably also multiple cue integration. So like when babies are learning their first languages because they have not like no knowledge innate to their brain, so they use as many cues as possible. So not just the statistical regularities in the sentences they're hearing, but also like the emotions that the caregivers are conveying and the intonation and some other nonverbal social cues.
I think it boils down to frequency of input, seems to me, that because the more you expose them to the same type of language in whatever context it is, the more, even if they're not aware of the chunks, but just the plain exposure to numerous ways of more or less the same with a slight variation obviously gives you an advantage. And then depending on what level of student you have, you can add the meta-linguistic principle behind it if you like. But I think chunking is also really mostly the exposure frequency of something in context.
Yes, chunking is largely based on both co-occurrence frequency and just like pure frequency, like how many times you're seeing a word or a chunk, and like how often these two or these component words like specifically go together across different situations. Yes, it is based on statistical regularities, but there may or may not be something about the individual. So like some people, they are more sensitive to statistical information in the environment, in the language. Some people are less sensitive, and generally babies are very, very sensitive because they have nothing to work with yet. Adults, on the other hand, because they have like been trained to do various tasks in their first language, they are generally less sensitive to a new language or sensitive to regularities in the second language. And as you said, that might be a good reason to still like introduce some meta-linguistic information to help them to pay attention to the correct sequences when they are learning.
Wonderful. Well, thank you everybody for joining us today. Let's give another round of applause for Dr. Wang for a wonderful presentation.